Hello, hello to another short story. Well, actually, today I have even two short stories for you. Both are very well fitting the month of Halloween, because both give off creepypasta vibes and both have an air of an urban legend with a spooky undertone reminiscent of eerie folklore. I simply couldn't decide which one to post, and since they are very short, I thought, why not post both of them? I mean, I juxtaposed poems in the past, so why not juxtapose short stories? Both have a similar theme, and both were written by Ambrose Bierce, the unmatched master of the short story. Both admittedly are not that surprising, but both are wonderfully creepy and perfect for listening to when wrapped up in a blanket. I'm curious which one you like better. When reading, I had a clear favorite. When editing the video, my favorite changed, and now that I sit here to introduce the stories, my favorite changed again. Let me know which one you prefer down in the comments. And now, grab a blanket if you want to and prepare for two creepy delights. Three and one are one. In the year 1861, Bar Lassiter, a young man of 22, lived with his parents and an elder sister near Carthage, Tennessee. The family were in somewhat humble circumstances, subsisting by cultivation of a small and not very fertile plantation. Owning no slaves, they were not rated among the best people of their neighborhood, but they were honest persons of good education, fairly well-mannered, and as respectable as any family could be if uncredentialed by personal dominion over the sons and daughters of Ham. The elder Lassiter had that severity of manner that so frequently affirms an uncompromising devotion to duty and conceals a warm and affectionate disposition. He was of the iron of which martyrs are made, but in the heart of the matrix had lurked a nobler metal, fusible at a milder heat, yet never coloring nor softening the hard exterior. By both heredity and environment, something of the man's inflexible character had touched the other members of the family. The Lassiter home, though not devoid of domestic affection, was a veritable citadel of duty, and duty. Duty is as cruel as death. When the war came on, it found in the family, as in so many others in that state, a divided sentiment. The young man was loyal to the Union, the others savagely hostile. This unhappy division begot an insupportable domestic bitterness, and when the offending son and brother left home with the avowed purpose of joining the Federal Army, not a hand was laid in his, not a word of farewell was spoken, not a good wish followed him out into the world, whither he went to meet with such spirit as he might whatever fate awaited him. Making his way to Nashville, already occupied by the army of General Buell, he enlisted in the first organization that he found, a Kentucky regiment of cavalry, and in due time passed through all the stages of military evolution from raw recruit too experienced trooper. A right good trooper he was too, although in his oral narrative from which this tale is made, there was no mention of that. The fact was learned from his surviving comrades. For Bar Lassiter has answered, "Here," to the sergeant, whose name is Death. 2 years after he had joined it, his regiment passed through the region whence he had come. The country thereabout had suffered severely from the ravages of war, having been occupied alternately and simultaneously by the belligerent forces, and a sanguinary struggle had occurred in the immediate vicinity of the Lassiter homestead. But of this the young trooper was not aware. Finding himself in camp near his home, he felt a natural longing to see his parents and sister, hoping that in them, as in him, the unnatural animosities of the period had been softened by time and separation. Obtaining a leave of absence, he set foot in the late summer afternoon, and soon after the rising of the full moon was walking up the gravel path leading to the dwelling in which he had been born. Soldiers in war age rapidly, and in youth 2 years are a long time. Bar Lassiter felt himself an old man, and had almost expected to find the place a ruin and a desolation. Nothing, apparently, was changed. At the sight of each dear and familiar object, he was profoundly affected. His heart beat audibly, his emotion nearly suffocated him. An ache was in his throat. Unconsciously, he quickened his pace until he almost ran, his long shadow making grotesque efforts to keep its place beside him. The house was unlighted, the door open. As he approached and paused to recover control of himself, his father came out and stood bareheaded in the moonlight. "Father!" cried the young man, springing forward with outstretched hand. "Father!" The elder man looked him sternly in the face, stood a moment motionless, and without a word withdrew into the house. Bitterly disappointed, humiliated, inexpressibly hurt, and altogether unnerved, the soldier dropped upon a rustic seat in deep dejection, supporting his head upon his trembling hand. But he would not have it so. He was too good a soldier to accept repulse as defeat. He rose and entered the house, passing directly to the sitting room. It was dimly lighted by an uncurtained east window. On a low stool by the hearth side, the only article of furniture in the place, sat his mother, staring into a fireplace strewn with blackened embers and cold ashes. He spoke to her tenderly, interrogatively, and with hesitation. But she neither answered nor moved, nor seemed in any way surprised. True, there had been time for her husband to apprise her of their guilty son's return. He moved nearer, and was about to lay his hand upon her arm when his sister entered the room from an adjoining room, looked him full in the face, passed him without a sign of recognition, and left the room by a door that was partly behind him. He had turned his head to watch her, but when he was gone, his eyes again sought his mother. She too had left the place. Bar Lassiter strode to the door by which he had entered. The moonlight on the lawn was tremulous, as if the sward were a rippling sea. The trees and their black shadows shook as in breeze. Blended with its borders, the gravel walk seemed unsteady and insecure to step on. This young soldier knew the optical illusions produced by tears. He felt them on his cheek and saw them sparkle on the breast of his trooper's jacket. He left the house and made his way back to camp. The next day, with no very definite intention, with no dominant feeling that he could rightly have named, he again sought the spot. Within a half-mile of it, he met Bushrot Albro, a former playfellow and schoolmate, who greeted him warmly. "I am going to visit my home," said the soldier. The other looked at him rather sharply, but said nothing. "I know," continued Lassiter, "that my folks have not changed, but—" "There have been changes," Albro interrupted. "Everything changes. I'll go with you if you don't mind. We can talk as we go." But Albro did not talk. Instead of a house, they found only fire-blackened foundations of stone enclosing an area of compact ashes, pitted by rains. Lassiter's astonishment was extreme. "I could not find the right way to tell you," said Albro. "In the fire a year ago, your house was burned by a federal shell." "And my family? Where are they?" "In heaven, I hope. All were killed by the shell." A wireless message. In the summer of 1896, Mr. William Holt, a wealthy manufacturer of Chicago, was living temporarily in a little town of central New York, the name of which the writer's memory has not retained. Mr. Holt had had trouble with his wife, from whom he had parted a year before. Whether the trouble was anything more serious than incompatibility of temper, he is probably the only living person that knows. He is not addicted to the vice of confidences. Yet, he has related the incident herein set down to at least one person without exacting a pledge of secrecy. He is now living in Europe. One evening he had left the house of a brother whom he was visiting for a stroll in the country. It may be assumed, whatever the value of the assumption in connection with what is said to have occurred, that his mind was occupied with reflections on his domestic infelicities and the distressing changes that they had wrought in his life. Whatever may have been his thoughts, they so possessed him that he observed neither the lapse of time nor whither his feet were carrying him. He knew only that he had passed far beyond the town limits and was traversing a lonely region by a road that bore no resemblance to the one by which he had left the village. In brief, he was lost. Realizing his mischance, he smiled. Central New York is not a region of perils, nor does one long remain lost in it. He turned about and went back the way that he had come. Before he had gone far, he observed that the landscape was growing more distinct, was brightening. Everything was suffused with a soft red glow in which he saw his shadow projected in the road before him. "The moon is rising," he said to himself. Then he remembered that it was about the time of the new moon, and if that tricksy orb was in one of its stages of visibility, it had set long before. He stopped and faced about, seeking the source of the rapidly broadening light. As he did so, his shadow turned and lay along the road in front of him as before. The light still came from behind him. That was surprising. He could not understand. Again, he turned, and again, facing successively to every point of the horizon. Always, the shadow was before, always the light behind, and still, awful red. Holt was astonished. Dumbfounded is the word that he used in telling it, yet seems to have retained a certain intelligent curiosity. To test the intensity of the light whose nature and cause he could not determine, he took out his watch to see if he could make out the figures on the dial. They were plainly visible, and the hands indicated the hour of 11 o'clock and 25 minutes. At that moment, the mysterious illumination suddenly flared to an intense and almost blinding splendor, flushing the entire sky, extinguishing the stars, and throwing the monstrous shadow of himself athwart the landscape. In that unearthly illumination, he saw, near him, but apparently in the air at a considerable elevation, the figure of his wife, clad in her night clothing and holding to her breast the figure of his child. Her eyes were fixed upon his with an expression which he afterward professed himself unable to name or describe, further than that it was not of this life. The flare was momentary, followed by black darkness, in which, however, the apparition still showed white and motionless. Then by insensible degrees it faded and vanished like a bright image on the retina after the closing of the eyes. A peculiarity of the apparition, hardly noted at the time but afterward recalled, was that it showed only the upper half of the woman's figure. Nothing was seen below the waist. The sudden darkness was comparative, not absolute, for gradually all objects of his environment became again visible. In the dawn of the morning, Holt found himself entering the village at a point opposite to that at which he had left. He soon arrived at the house of his brother, who hardly knew him. He was wild-eyed, haggard, and grey as a rat. Almost incoherently, he related his night's experience. "Go to bed, my poor fellow," said his brother, "and wait, we shall hear more of this." An hour later came the predestined telegram. Holt's dwelling, in one of the suburbs of Chicago, had been destroyed by fire. Her escape cut off by the flames, his wife had appeared at an upper window, her child in her arms. There, she had stood motionless, apparently dazed. Just as the fireman had arrived with a ladder, the floor had given way, and she was seen no more. The moment of this culminating horror was 11 o'clock and 25 minutes Standard Time.